I already covered the best games to get somebody into retro gaming, so of course we gotta cover some of the worst games, right? It would be really easy to just list a bunch of games that are flat out awful, but the catch here is that these are games I consider to be good overall, but just not great games to introduce people to retro games with. Of course, I'm sure a lot of you watching can come up with some fun answers as well, so be thinking about which games you might pick as I go through mine. Okay, the first game on my list has gotta be Contra Hardcore for Sega Genesis. The Contra games are known for their difficulty and fun gameplay overall, but unlike most other challenging retro games, this game comes at you like a bat out of hell right from the word go. Like, literally, you could hand somebody new the controller, and just in the amount of time it takes them to look at their controller to see what they're playing with, they could already be dead. Scratch that, dead twice. And yeah, actually, you know what? Game over. Great first impression, right? This game moves at a blisteringly fast pace, and it's super overwhelming for a newcomer to try to jump in and do much of anything before they get crushed. To make things even more challenging, this version we got in the USA is actually more difficult because you can only take 1 hit per life as opposed to 3 hits per life like you can in the Japanese version. And actually, you can play the easier Japanese version if you own a Sega Genesis Mini by simply changing the language to Japanese, and I would highly recommend trying this out if you do. Anyways, this change in difficulty makes the game tougher because not only does it allow you less hits that you can take, but you lose the weapon you're currently using with each life. So for a newcomer, not only would they be burning through precious few lives, but they'd also be constantly trying to get used to different new weapons. The game does have co-op, but I don't think that's really going to help because everything moves too quickly for you to be able to try to protect them anyway. But hey, if you were a master at the game, I suppose that could be an interesting challenge. The next game on my list might be a bit of a controversial choice, but just hear me out. The game is Ducktales for the NES, and while this game was loved by a lot of us as kids, the standards around game difficulty have changed dramatically since then, and I feel like this game is almost kind of deceptive in a way. The first thing you're greeted to when you boot up the game is a wonderful 8-bit rendition of that familiar DuckTales theme song, instantly putting a newcomer in the mindset of, oh, this is a kids-friendly game, no problem. But it's not. It's got some good challenge to it, and while it's certainly not the hardest NES game, it definitely puts up a fight. At least for somebody who hasn't spent their entire life playing the game like a lot of its fans have. However, more than anything, I think the unique control mechanics that make it such a fun and memorable game are also what make it difficult for a newbie to pick up and do well. In most traditional 2D platformers, you can take out enemies by simply jumping on top of them, but in this game you have to hold down on the D-pad in addition to the attack button, and if you don't, then you will get hit and lose some of your life bar. As much fun and as useful as the pogo stick mechanic with the cane can be, it's definitely very unique to the game and can certainly take some getting used to, even if it feels completely innate to those of us who have played the game a lot. Alright, next game on the list is Goldeneye for the Nintendo 64. A lot of people will tell you that this game hasn't aged well enough for it to be worth it for anybody to be playing nowadays, but we'll leave that discussion for another video. As it pertains to this video, I think Goldeneye is a rough game to get people into retro gaming with, mostly because of the controls and how the standards for first-person shooters have changed. The biggest thing is that here you only have a single analog stick, as opposed to the now default 2 sticks that lets you use the left analog stick for movement and the right analog stick to aim your gun. Since the Nintendo 64 controller only has a single analog stick, the solution ended up being by relegating some of the movement to the 4 yellow C buttons, which is not ideal to say the least. And yes, there actually is an option to have 2 analog sticks you can use by using 2 controllers, but people already complain enough as it is that the Nintendo 64 controller has 3 handles, so just imagine how overwhelming it would be for a newcomer to have 6 handles to now worry about. Okay, the next game on the list is another really good one, and it's Herzogs Vive for Sega Genesis. This game is actually some people's favorite game for the entire system, but it can be very difficult to understand. For starters, you really need to have somebody there to help explain the game to you, or read the manual pretty thoroughly, which can immediately be a huge turnoff. I mean, if you have to spend half an hour explaining to somebody how to play a game before they actually know what they're doing, every board game ever, you may have already lost them along the way and killed any enthusiasm they might have had. Heck, this is one of those games that some retro gamers never develop the patience or interest to get into. It's just a very specific kind of real-time strategy game that will only appeal to a very particular crowd. It took me a long time to finally come around to this one, and I love the Sega Genesis, so I had every reason to give it a chance. As far as the particulars of the game itself, one of the most off-putting things is just how a lot of stuff isn't clearly labeled. For example, a lot of the names of things are just abbreviated with a single letter or maybe a few letters. So it's like, okay, we've got 4 things that are labeled the letter B, the letter D, the letter G, and the letter E. What the hell am I even looking at? What do they stand for? This is an awesome game once you get the hang of it for sure, but there's definitely a learning curve, and I would definitely not recommend this one to sell people early on retro games. Well, except for maybe some of the awesome music it has, since you don't actually have to play the game for that. The last game on my list is one of my favorite Sega Saturn games, and that would be Nights into Dreams. Now, this is actually a lot of people's favorite game for the system just because of what a unique experience it is. Seriously, there's nothing really quite like this game. However, because it's so unique, it can also be really confusing for newcomers trying to figure out what exactly you're supposed to be doing, let alone just simply how to control it. This game is well known for being the game that utilized the 3D controller, which looks like this. And let me tell you, the analog stick on this is unlike any other analog stick you've ever used. I'm not saying it's bad, but it definitely feels really different and will throw people off who are used to more modern analog sticks, or pretty much any other analog stick that's ever existed for that matter. It feels like it has quite a bit of resistance, and it's almost more like sliding a ball around that's locked in place than it is pivoting a stick from a central base. Oh, and if you're wondering what it feels like to use a regular controller with this game, you can do it, but for me personally, it really started to hurt my hand after not too long. As for the game itself, this is where players can become lost, and even if you have somebody there to explain it. I've seen a lot of newcomers really confused on where exactly they can go, and then you gotta know about loop-de-loops, how to utilize them, certain things you want to avoid at some points, but then go after at other times. Yeah, your brain just has to process this game in a completely different way than a lot of other games. Okay, so that does it for my list of games, but what's kind of funny is just how much fun I had playing all these games to get the footage for this video. Even though I say these games aren't good for beginners, some of them are so inspired and unique that I suppose they could get somebody interested in gaming. But more than anything, I would wholeheartedly recommend these games to those of us who are already big retro game enthusiasts. If you haven't already played them, of course. Alright, so that brings us now to your opportunity to list the games that you think are good examples of games that you wouldn't want to introduce somebody to retro gaming with. And remember, they have to be games that you think are actually good overall. No listing games you think suck, alright? Okay, deal. So leave those comments down below and I will see ya in the next video.